Now, what we have here, there's another arrow you might notice to this, and this is what we call blood colloid osmotic pressure. I think the OpenStax calls it blood colloidal osmotic pressure, one and the same. And what do you notice about this arrow? Instead of going outside of the vessel like CHP, it's actually going toward the inside of the vessel. So it's some force moving fluid back into the vessel. So instead of going from the inside out, BCOP goes from the outside in. Now this process is called reabsorption. So filtration is moving from the inside of a vessel toward the outside and the interstitial fluid, whereas reabsorption, now you're bringing fluid from the outer tissues and the interstitial fluid and back into the vessels. So again, if we only had filtration, your vessels would constantly lose a lot of water every day. But thankfully, you have reabsorption to bring fluids back in. And there's about 20.4 liters per day bringing the fluids back in. Now, if you're very observant, you might be like, wait, wasn't it 24 before? And when we get to the lymphatics, I'll address that inequality. Okay, so what is this BCOP? What is this blood colloid osmotic pressure? You might be like, oh, I know what blood is. I kind of know what pressure is. And osmotic. So if you're not sure what osmosis is, this is a good time to go back to my cell biology and transport lectures, because you definitely need to know osmosis for this semester, especially when we're talking about blood pressure and when we get to the kidneys, you definitely need to know about osmosis. So what is blood colloidal osmotic pressure, or BCOP? Well, it's a pressure exerted by blood colloids within a vessel. So again, colloid is a type of mixture, and it's a suspension in a liquid, and it's mostly caused by the presence of proteins in your blood. And these proteins, what they do is that they kind of draw in water, and this is called oncotic pressure. So it's related to osmosis, but instead of things like sodium, chloride, glucose, or other ions and solutes drawing in water, you have special proteins in your plasma of your blood that help to draw in water back into your vessels. Okay, so then we have to go back to that previous picture and look a little closer. Now, again, this is the inside of the capillary and the lumen, and where we have all the blood plasma. This is the interstitial fluid. So what we see here are things like glucose, ions, and invisible water being pushed via capillary hydrostatic pressure through these little pores. But what do we have with what are these little bigger blobs? These are blood proteins. Now with these blood proteins, notice that they don't actually filter through. So they're too big to actually push through from the plasma into the interstitial fluid. So the thing is that large proteins, especially a special protein we call albumins, these should stay in the blood in a normal individual with healthy capillaries. Now, what we see here is so we have to talk about a related thing called oncotic pressure. Now, it is some sort of pressure, it is a force, but it's a more I like to think of oncotic pressure as osmotic pressure, but instead of salts, instead of sugars, it's due to proteins. So there's a special type of osmosis. And what do we have here? Here we have an example, and these yellow blobs are representing proteins. Pretend these are sodium ions or something. In osmosis, this would be replaced with sodium ions or potassium ions or chloride ions or glucose. But here we have proteins instead. Now, if we have equal amounts of water at both sides, which way will the water be more attracted to? The side with more proteins or the side with less proteins? And we don't have too many people in the chat, but okay, which side do you think the water will be attracted to? The blood side or the interstitial fluid side? So the yellow blobs are proteins, and then we have all our water molecules. Yep, it'll be attracted to the side with more protein, and that's what we have here. So with more protein in the blood, the water gets attracted to all that protein. So this is why you have oncotic pressure, and it's contributing to BCOP. So this is one of the major forces behind that BCOP pressure, And what do you notice? Instead of pushing from the blood to the interstitial fluid, we drew in water from the interstitial fluid back into the blood. So this is a major balancing force compared to capillary hydrostatic pressure. Okay, so then this is why we reabsorb things, because again, with all the proteins in our bloodstream, especially albumin, it's going to draw water back in. So it is a force, and this is why we refer to it as a pressure. So blood colloid osmotic pressure, or BCOP for short. Again, let's take a little cross sections going from the arterial side and then the venual side and somewhere in between. So what we have here is oncotic pressure. So we have our little proteins that help to draw in water. So large proteins should not filter out of blood vessels. So this is why I showed that zoomed in picture before. So you know, small things like water, ions, like amino acids and sugars, they were filtering through, but those big, large proteins, they couldn't quite fit through that gap. So what should happen to the protein concentration when you go from the arterial side to the venual side? If these proteins don't filter through, you should have the same amount of protein going from one side of the capillary to the other. So what we have here is that we have that oncotic pressure, which contributes to blood colloid osmotic pressure, and this is going to draw water back into your vessels. So, and this BCOP stays relatively consistent from one end to the other. And why is that? Well, again, the proteins, which are the major factor contributing to this pressure, these large proteins stay constant in concentration. Even though we do have that pressure, they're too big to be forced out. Thereby, if they stay in the same concentration, you should have the same BCOP going from arterial to venual side. So BCOP, you can think of it this way. This is the force caused by plasma proteins that instead of, remember, CHP, capillary hydrostatic pressure, pushes from the inside out, but now we're drawing water from the outside in.